Hey guys, what's happening? Garrett here, and today we're going to go over manual mode. Yes, the M on the camera that no one uses. This is the mode that I use probably 99% of the time when I'm taking pictures. We're going to get you away from automatic so that you're making those changes to the settings yourself. All of these settings have to do with each other. You change one, you're more than likely going to have to change the other because they all have to do with the exposure of the picture you're taking. So hopefully by the end of this video, you'll have a better understanding of the manual mode and you'll be able to do it yourself. Let's get into it. When using manual, there are three main settings that you're going to be looking at. And those are your ISO, your aperture, also known as your f-stop, and your shutter speed. First, we're going to talk about ISO. And the ISO has a lot to do with the clarity of your image, as well as the amount of light you have to take that image. Because your ISO has to do with how sensitive your camera sensor is to the light. The lower number ISO you have, say around 100, you're going to get a clearer, crisp image, but you're also going to need a lot of light to do that. And with a higher ISO, you're going to get a noisier image, and you're going to need a lot less light. The best way my teacher explained it in photography class was by drawing a line with little bubbles on it right next to each other, and then another line with the bubbles a little farther apart. She told us that the line with the bubbles right next to each other was a lower number ISO, which made the image more crisp because the sensitive particles, I guess, on the film were closer to each other, giving you a crisper image. And where the line with the bubbles separated gave you a noisier picture, but you needed less light. And that kind of gave me the understanding of how the ISO worked. When shooting outdoors, you're more likely going to be shooting with a lower number ISO because you have the sun for a light source. And when shooting indoors, you're more likely to use a higher number ISO because you don't have as much light. You can use a flash, which will help compensate for that, but you're still more than likely going to be using a higher number ISO. So the main thing to remember when changing your ISO or looking for the settings you need is the amount of light you have to take that photograph. Second, we'll talk about aperture, also known as the f-stop. Your aperture is your depth of field. You know when you see an image where the background's blurred but the subject is crisp? That means that the photographer has more than likely used a lens with a lower f-stop. When you use a lower f-stop on your subject, it'll be in focus. And when you use a higher f-stop, your whole image will be in focus and you won't have a blurred background. A lower number f-stop is used more in macro and portrait photography. And for landscape and night photography, you should be using a higher f-stop, say 16 to 22. The f-stop can range anywhere from, usually the lowest is about a 1.4 to the highest of about an f22. The f-stop is a setting that you change on your camera, but it has to do mainly with your lens. Most lenses will tell you the lowest f-stop possible on the lens itself, or say when you're going to buy one, it'll put it in the description. Changing the f-stop opens and closes the aperture iris within the lens. When you're using a lower f-stop, it opens up the aperture, allowing more light to come in. And when you close the aperture iris, it prevents more light from coming in. And that's where your shutter speed can come into play. So when you're taking a picture of someone, say you're taking a portrait, you're going to have a lower f-stop, and that person is going to be in focus, but their background is going to be blurred. And when you're taking the picture of the outside of a tree, but you want the whole landscape, you're going to open up the f-stop a little bit so that it gets everything in focus. So something to remember about f-stop is that when it's lower, it's opened up, so you're getting more light. And when you're using a higher f-stop, it closes, and you're going to get less light. So that's where you might need to change your shutter speed or change your ISO. And last but certainly not least, we have shutter speed. Your shutter speed is the amount of time you're exposing your sensor to light, taking the picture. The lower the number, the longer the exposure. And the higher the number, the faster the exposure. The lowest you can go with shutter speed is bulb, which just allows you to snap, hold it open as long as you want, and then hit it again, and then there's your picture. And the fastest shutter speed, usually on modern cameras nowadays, is 1/400th of a second, which takes it pretty quick. When using a lower shutter speed, you're more than likely going to be taking landscape pictures, night shots, and in low light situations. The lowest you want to go with shutter speed is about 1/60th of a second in your hand. That if you go any lower, it's going to be blurry. So anything lower than 1/60th, you're going to want to use a tripod. A good example of a long exposure is night shots, where you see little streaks in the sky, and those are actually stars, because the stars have moved because the shutter was open so long that it captured the movement of the Earth. The faster shutter speeds are used more for sports and trying to capture things that are moving really quick. Possibly something like animals, because you never know when they're going to move. Something to remember with shutter speed is that also has to do with light. So say you have a f2, which means your aperture is open, and you have an ISO of 100, but you don't have a lot of light, you might need to bring your shutter speed down to maybe 1/60th or 1/80th, whatever your camera allows. Or say you've got a lot of light, so your ISO is at 100, but it's still pretty overexposed, and you have your aperture to where you want it, so you don't want to, you want it down lower, so there's a lot more light. You're going to want to be using a faster shutter speed so that it just clicks real quick, so the shutter is only exposed for, or the sensor is only exposed for so long to take that picture. So things to remember as I close out is that these three settings all have to do with the exposure of your picture, and if one of them isn't where it needs to be, your photo might not turn out as you want it. Using manual lets you control your photo. Using manual lets you control what your photo is going to look like as far as light goes. And for crisper photos, you want to use a lower ISO. And for a good medium ground aperture, anywhere between a 3 and a 4 is a good place to be. Make sure to like, subscribe, and comment below, and tell me what you thought of the video. Thanks for watching. See you next time.